My name is Ann Cadwell, and I'm the Retail Sector Specialist for the Canadian Nursery Landscape Association. Thank you for taking the time today to attend our Garden Centre Canada webinar with Dr. Charlie Hall. Garden Centres Canada is a commodity group of the CNLA, and we specifically focus on independent garden centers, interests, education, networking, training, and marketing. We're very fortunate today because we're not only joined by the retail sector, but all those in our horticulture value chain, which includes our growers and our landscape professionals. Welcome, everybody. Some quick housekeeping items, which you're all aware of being on Zoom. Your microphones will be muted, the cameras are off, and if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. Dr. Hall is also willing to answer anything that you might also want to put in the chat. It's a pretty relaxed webinar. Also, to let you know that we are recording this webinar and it will be available to you afterwards on our CNLA YouTube channel. Dr. Charlie Hall, he has deep roots in our green industry, having grown up in a nursery in Western North Carolina. And now he's an economist. He's also a professor at the Department of Horticulture Science at Texas A&M University and holds the prestigious Ellison Chair, International Floriculture. Now, I've known Charlie for some time, and I can go on about his expertise, including innovative management, marketing strategies, financial analysis, benchmarking. But I think I'm going to just pass it over to you, Dr. Hall. You have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. We'll try to address the Q&A as we go, but again, I'm going to leave enough time at the end for you to ask some questions, so don't worry about that. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to leave my Q&A box over here. All right. Go to the next slide. This is a very simple supply chain diagram of the green industry. And of course, today, I'm going to say a little bit about the allied trade down here at the bottom. You see the allied trade is the manufacturers and distributors that produce everything that growers use, which is in the yellow box, to produce the high quality flowers, shrubs, and trees that we do, which we then sell either directly to the consumer through e-commerce, or we use re-wholesalers, or we sell sometimes direct to landscape service providers. Or if we're selling through the retail channel, we may sell to box stores or IGCs, independent garden centers. And then lastly, you got residential and institutional consumers or customers. So that's the basic supply chain. It's a little more complex than that, but let's not make a big mountain out of a molehill. So what we're seeing here, I'm going to focus on all these sectors and talk a little bit about where we're headed, where we've been and where we've headed in terms of okay, I'm just checking all right, done. I'm just checking the Q&A box just to make sure, because it had two of them still left there. All right, so let's talk about growers, first of all. And I have an annual, biannual benchmarking system where I collect data January through June and July through December for growers, right? There's a number of benchmarking efforts that are done for landscapers and a number that are being conducted for retailers, but the one I'm handling is strictly for growers. And what we see here, if we look back through time, and this is both U.S. and Canadian firms, I have a mix there. There's obviously a few more U.S. firms than Canadian firms, but this is basically representative of U.S. and Canada in terms of the supply chain. Now, I didn't separate the Canadian growers by themselves because I wanted to have enough volume there to show the overall trend. And so the green line here is basically the 12-month moving average, and the red dotted line is basically a regression line that's fit through those data. All right, so you see whether it's gross or net sales, and the difference there is usually credits, allowances, or any sales price adjustments. That's the difference between gross and net here. Both of them are trending upward, and particularly during the pandemic years. And I've got 2021, 22, and 23. This is up until the end of 2023 because we haven't gotten to the end of 2024, so I don't have that data yet. I'll be collecting it as soon as the year's over. So if you look at top line sales for growers, it's actually pretty favorable, right? The pandemic was good to us. People were staying at home. They were traveling less, spending less on hotels and bars and restaurants and airfare and so forth. And so they looked out at their landscapes while they were sheltering in place and said, man alive, I got to do something about this landscape. And so they bought more flowers, shrubs, and trees, and they bought more landscape services. So the pandemic was actually kind of a boom for us. Now, when you look at the bottom line, a little different story because 2021, you see, it's the year that sticks out here. So I've been involved with the industry. I grew up on a nursery in Western North Carolina. So I've been involved with the industry my entire life. And as an economist for the last 36 years, well, longer than that if you include my graduate school years. And so I've never seen a year where top line sales and bottom line net profits were as stellar as they were in 2021. Now, we've had post freezes and we've had some supply shocks from different things, but this is the first year that I've seen that kind of net profit. So you can see since then, net profit has declined. And even if you put it on a full-time equivalent basis, that's what FTE means there. Basically, the number of full-time people that you have in your operation, plus all the part-time hours divided by 2080, which is that's the number of hours in a year. So you've got a full-time equivalent there. All right. So if you break down this net profit in this table here, I've got it by greenhouse and by nursery by size. And so I'm not going to have this slide up long enough for you to copy down every single thing, but you can look and see if you're online and you're in the grower sector, you can see that. But there is the recording, and you could go back through the recording, pause, and then you could take a look a little bit further at the data. But even among nurseries, just take nurseries right here by size. You got those that are above 50 million in sales and those below 5 million in sales. You can see that it's very mixed in terms of performance by year. And even within the same sector, the same nurseries versus greenhouses, it differs by size. And so not always are larger nurseries more profitable. Sometimes it's the smaller, more nimble growers that are more profitable. Now, regardless of whether you're large, small, which year it was, whether it was a pandemic year or non-pandemic year, shrink or scrap or dump, whatever you call it in your operation, that's the low-hanging fruit. Because even in 2021, which there was high top line sales and high net profit, I think we had $148 million worth of shrink just between the 63 firms that I put. There's more firms in my database, but I only included the ones that had data for 2015 through 23. So shrink is always the low-hanging fruit. Now, really, that's not any different than retail or landscape. Shrink is always something we have to contend with. And you got transportation cost over there, but those are what they are. And again, I've got a table based off of size of firm, what the shrink levels were, the shrink percentages, and you can see that nurseries typically have more shrink than greenhouses. Well, duh, you got a protected environment in the greenhouse situation. But it varies by size, and so it's not always the bigger firms that have the lowest shrink. Sometimes it's exactly opposite. Now, I had two working capital ratios built into the system this time. I mention it because at the grower sector, there's a couple of things that have caused some shakeout in recent years. Now, I just said during the pandemic, we had expanded sales The demand was increased because of the sheltering in place effect, and you've got a number of firms that made a lot of money during post. I'll call it expansion times. If you look right after the good times, that's usually when we have a shakeout in the industry. And if all the trade press that we've been seeing in the industry, all the trade magazines, sure enough, we've seen some pretty sizable firms go out of business over the last 4 years, in spite of getting government assistance during the pandemic and in spite of having expanded sales, and yet they went out. Well, most of the time, when firms go out of business, it's from two main reasons. Either number one, they were over leveraged and that the bank had more skin in the bank than they did, right? So they over leveraged their business. So they owed more to the bank than what they had coming in. Or two, they mismanaged working capital. And this is where I measured that this time. You got the working capital ratio, in which you're looking at current assets, current liabilities, and making that division there. And you can see that working capital is rather mixed through the years. So sometimes the liquidity of the business, and this is really taking everybody's working capital and combining it as though it's one great big operation. So that's when I say aggregate working capital ratio, that's everybody's assets divided by everybody's liabilities. And you can see that the industry is being fairly somewhat liquid, somewhat able to cover unexpected expenses, but not all the time. And then this metric on the right is average working capital days of coverage. You're not going to find that in a textbook. I made it up. But here's what my logic was. I asked myself, what if we had the situation like during the pandemic when we weren't deemed essential early on and we didn't have any money coming in? How long would it take for us to burn through the working capital that we've got in place by paying all of our cost of goods sold and paying all of our SG&A, all of our overhead? How long could we survive by doing that? And the average for the entire, if you add everybody's stuff all together, was 142 days. Well, that was pretty good. But when you separate it out, greenhouses versus nursery, greenhouses could last actually a shorter amount of time than the nurseries. And you think about the short-term versus long-term nature of the crop and the perishability and the shelf life of greenhouse crops versus nursery crops, and it makes a little sense. I've got some firms that only had 14 days worth of working capital. And I've got other firms that are over a year's worth of working capital. Very different financial position. So anytime you go, pre-pandemic days, we were still recovering from the Great Recession and we were doing pretty good, right? Housing was pretty good. Well, you had some challenges there in Canada that I'll get to here in a second. So this is basically, we're working through that burn rate. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on the past. I want to look at the future. And this is data from folks that have been through my EAGLE program, which is my executive education program for growers. And it's like an executive MBA for nursery and greenhouse growers, and also folks that are in my benchmarking. It's called Your Market Metrics. There's the logo right there, the acronym YMM. That means from the benchmarking. So there's 110 folks there that I asked, how were your top line sales January through June this year compared to last year, right? And you see that, I'm going to get this out of the way. I'm not sure if this is blocking some of your view, but it's blocking mine. Move that over there. So I asked, the top line sales, were they up by more than 25%, like over here on the left where my cursor is, or are they down more than 25% over here where my cursor is? So you see a bell-shaped curve. And you had some firms, a few, that were up by more than 25%, some up by 11 to 15%. Most of the folks, though, this whole center where the bell is and the bell-shaped curve, those are the majority of the folks that were either up 0 to 10% or down 0 to 10%. And then you got some folks over here on the right that are down, significantly year over year. Now, let me just pause for a second. When you're considering the growth of your business and you're trying to manage through something like a pandemic, and you're looking at some good years, and then we're starting to see a little bit of a slowdown in the industry, both in U.S. and Canada, and because of the housing issues that you're having in Canada, and a little bit of a slowdown. And it's tempting to say, when you look at year over year comparisons, it's tempting to say sky is falling, or it's tempting to say, hey, we're doing just fine. You can't just manage off a year to year. So that's why I asked the question down at the bottom here. And let me go over to the chat. Do you have, okay, nothing in the chat right there. So when I share my screen again, down here at the bottom, I said, now let's compare it to pre-pandemic. How is your top line sales January through June this year compared to 2019? And you can see the vast majority of folks are up over 2019. So that's what I'm saying. Just because your sales were down in 2023 or down in the first part of 2024, it doesn't mean that the sky is falling. You got to take the bigger picture and say, well, where are we at compared to 2019? All right. So don't get all freaked out here in the short run. Now, net profit, you see the same bell-shaped curve, but the two tails, you had 19% that were up by more than 25%. You had 9% over here on the right-hand side that were down by more than 25%. So again, very mixed results. But when I ask people compared to pre-pandemic, where you stand in terms of bottom line net profit, you can see that you've got a bunch of folks over here positive rather than negative. There are some that are negative, but there's the vast majority of folks that are positive. And when you look at the net profit, again, I'm sticking with growers. I'll talk retail and landscape here in a second. So these are the number of firms that have supplied data for all those years. This is the last 5 years. And so you got some firms over here on the left that are just making ridiculous levels of net profit. And then the more you go to the right, you got more firms that are in the single profit digits, single digit net profit. And then over here on the right, you got folks that are down every single year. Those are firms I worry about, because quite frankly, if you can't make money during this time period where there's been expanded sales, I gotta really shake my head and ask, is this firm really going to be able to make money at any point in time? So that's what goes through my mind when I see that kind of data. All right, here we go. And what does X mean? So the X-axis, I got you. So the X-axis is simply the number of firms, right? It's not, when I say number one, it's just the first firm in the database, the second firm, the third firm, the fourth firm, the fifth firm. Good question. And I just clarified that. Okay, so let's talk about, if we talked about top line and we talked about bottom line, what about units? Because actually we did get some price increases. So what's happened there? Well, you can see the unit growth there. There's another bell-shaped curve, and you have some down at the bottom whose units have increased, but you've got some whose units have decreased. So it's very, very mixed in terms of what we're seeing there in terms of units. This is one firm that sold to a lot of states, and here's my point. 2002, 2023, 2024. The red means they were down in that state. The black means that their sales were positive in that state. So you just can't say that 2022 or 2023 was a fantastic year, because you got to look at where we were the year before, and vice versa. You see 2024 is mirroring some of what they saw in 2022 in terms of being on the Eastern Seaboard, and you take a look at that 3-year compound average growth rate. And that's if I'm going to be looking at my sales and analyzing my sales, that's a good approach. Now let's talk retail, right? And retail gross sales, this is 51 firms from 29 states plus Canada. We do have some Canadian retailers in this Your Market Metrics retail database. Ian Baldwin handles that data. I don't do that data, but it's all in the same online dashboard, so I'm able to access it. And here's the retail sector. You see gross sales, 23 versus 2019, we're still up 37% over where we were pre-pandemic. But if you look at the end of year 23 versus 2022, everybody was down slightly. Again, that's the aggregate for the entire group of garden centers. And then you've got the customer count. Well, the customer count was down a little bit, 23 over 2022, but we still had 12.2% more customers coming through the door than we did pre-pandemic. Gross margin dollars, again, up versus 2019, slightly down year over year from 23 over 22. Labor dollars, well, I don't know if that ever goes down. As you see, for year over year up here at the top of this chart, it's continuing to go up because the cost of labor goes up. Labor hours, the average sale, let's focus on that one. It was basically even, up by 0.4%, but we're still 22% over where we were in 2019. And if you take the number of items in the basket size was up 44%, and year over year, the basket size was higher as well. Let me go back, the unit price, both down, but we had the unit price was higher during 21 and 22. Now, if we look at 2024, just like I did with growers, and just only look at 2024, I've got some summary slides here in terms of sales volume, and that's median sales year to date, and that's through September, right? So there's a little bit of a lag here through September. Then sales are up by 27% compared to 2019, like you see down at the bottom. But year over year, if you look at the change versus 2023, we're down almost 5%. Customer count is down 4% over here on the right, but compared to 2019, we're still up. And then, of course, labor hours, the units down year over year, but up over 2019. Average sale, both down just very slightly compared to from last year versus this year, or this year versus last year, but still down over 2019 as well. All right, so basket size, both down just very slightly. Unit price was still up. If you could, the year over year, 24 versus 23, 4% increase. And we're 1.4% over where we were in 2019. So what accounts for the massive drop in unit price in 23? That's a great question, Greg. A few graphs back in terms of that unit price. You're talking about retailers, I'm assuming. So let's go back here. And unit price, and there was, you see the drop, and this is what he's talking about, the drop here in 2023 versus the previous years. And I can't answer that fully, but there was some pushback in 23 in terms of the unit price increases. Now this is, remember, you're looking at it in dollars and percentages, and so I'm attributing that to the fact that we got so much gain in price. If you look compared to 21 and 22, and a little bit later on, I'm going to focus, a little bit later on, I'm going to focus on the index of prices paid. And during the 4 years during the pandemic, prices increased by 21%, which meant that growers tried to increase their prices 21%, which meant retail, you had to pass those increased price of plants. You had to pass that on to customers. And so for 2 years running in 22 and 21 and 22, you implemented those price increases. And then by the time 23 rolled around, that you couldn't get as much of a price increase there as what we had seen earlier. All right, so that's Greg. I know that's just part of the answer, but that's all I got right now in terms of that data. Box stores, real quick. If you look at because I know that there's some folks. Home Depot has a presence in Canada, so I'm going to just talk about box stores just very quickly compared to IGCs. So look at this: 2019, $110 billion in sales, $110 billion. If you look at the sales in 2023 by department, indoor garden's the number one department in the store. And then you got outdoor garden here that is down the list a little bit. Ironically, it's the outdoor power equipment that's also included in those categories. So Greg, again, I popped open the Q&A. Could it be that larger materials sold out during the pandemic? Yes, very much so, because in fact, you as retailers were buying stuff, some stuff you bought, it wasn't even in spec yet. And so it could be that some of that larger plant materials, so that price per unit decreased during that time period. Do you measure days sales of inventory? That's a good question, Marcel. I don't know the answer to that question because I don't handle the retail side of your market metrics. Ian does that. I don't think that that's part of it. So I don't quote me, right? I could be wrong, but I don't see that in any of the data. So I don't think that any other capacity that they're measuring that. So this is Home Depot's revenue, and you can see the effect of the pandemic. It's going up, right? Rather aggressively. And then it's been the last 5 or 6 quarters, it's been going down. And you can see that down there at the bottom, year over year quarterly growth, you see this red negative. And on the earnings calls, you hear Home Depot lamenting the fact that things are slowing down. But if you compare there's $110 billion at the end of 2019 and 20. So if the year finishes up the way it has been, then Home Depot's revenue is going to be $152 billion. So that's about $42 billion ahead of what they were pre-pandemic. If you look at their EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, it's not the same as net profit, but it's a profitability measure. It's still the same thing. Profitability has been going down. But in 2019, they had just shy of 18 billion in terms of EBITDA. And in 2024, if the year finishes the way that's expected, it'd be close to 25. So that's roughly a $7 billion difference in terms of EBITDA or EBITDA, I call it. I'm from the South. That's what I call it. And so it makes a big difference in mindset here. I know a lot of growers selling to Home Depot talk about Home Depot pushing back on the price increases. Well, I tell them, well, you push right back and say, well, you got $7 billion worth of profits that why are you cutting me? I'm your number one department in the store. So why are you cutting me? Why don't you go over to the paint and cut prices there? Anyway, outdoor equipment and supplies, just to show you a little bit of a change there. I didn't mean to press that button. You definitely see the pandemic influence, and then post-pandemic, starting in 23, you can see we pick right up on the same growth curve as what we had before. Total landscape market, the forecast for the landscape market is positive, and a lot of that is because of demographics, and it's because of the number of houses being built in the U.S., and with the interest rate reductions there in Canada, you're starting to see a little bit of an uptick in housing being built because you have a supply issue of houses in Canada. You've got more people that want houses than the houses you've got. So you need to build more houses quickly, but the interest rates have been precluding that. But now that The Bank of Canada is pulling back on interest rates. And so when the central bank does that, mortgage rates follow. So then you have more building that's going on. So you got to figure out how you get more houses being built so you can put flowers, shrubs, and trees and landscape services around them. And there's a number of government policies that are being talked about by Canadian legislators right now on how we can incentivize housing, how you guys can incentivize housing to build more houses more quickly, get the immigrants that have come in, and the number of people wanting houses has increased because of that. You got a little change in your immigration policy. So that now you've got, again, more people that need houses than what houses you've got. So they're talking about different alternatives to stimulate the housing market. All right, but I'll talk more about housing in a second. The reason I put real private fixed investment in here is because, again, just to show the lump of investment that was made during the pandemic. This is U.S. data, so I won't spend too much time. But obviously, we've been spending a lot on building houses, particularly during the pandemic. You see the jump there, and then we're back on trend. Same way with non-residential in the commercial real estate sector. But I want to deviate. I don't want to spend too much time on the U.S. except where it relates back to Canadian situation. So I'm going through these slides kind of quickly. But the construction spending in the U.S., because the Fed lowered the rate by 50 basis points, we're likely going to see the Fed and your central bank in Canada lowering interest rates from now to the end of 2025, and that's going to stimulate housing in both places. So for our industry, this is data from flower seeds and potted plants. This is straight out of the U.S. GDP data. And I want to show you real quickly to show that before the pandemic, we were growing very slowly, and then we grew faster, and now we're flattening off again. So that same flattening that you've been seeing in Canada, we're experiencing in the U.S. But again, it's important to look at where you are compared to 2019. When I take this year on the far right, press click, and I compare it to pre-pandemic, you can see the difference in the slope of the lines. You can see we're well above where we are. Now, why would I do that? It's because in every single economic downturn since 1948, we have seen a shot in the arm, both in the U.S. and Canada, in terms of the lawn and garden activity during the midst of an economic downturn. It's the stay-at-home effect. More people are staying home, the more they're buying lawn, flower, shrubs, trees, lawn care products, and so forth. So we get that shot in the arm. Yet, after the recovery starts and people start buying durable goods again, they're buying cars, furniture, houses, etc. They're buying less flowers, shrubs, and trees. So our recession usually begins in the first part of the recovery cycle in the business cycle. It's happened that way every single time. So it's very interesting that this time we had 18 to 20 million more new customers during the pandemic. And so far, we've not come back down to 2019 levels and then start growing again. We're still above where we were in 2000. I think that's a pretty good point, and I think it's a good point to emphasize just so that in your mind, you don't let year-over-year data shape your strategic vision for your business, whether you're a grower, retail, landscape. You look at the trending over time, and then you check where you were 5 years ago, and that gives you a little different perspective. Because if you only look at year over year, you'll say, I don't need to make that capital expenditure, or I don't need to hire another 20 workers and so forth. But when you start looking at it from the standpoint of where you are versus 5 years ago and what the opportunities are in the marketplace, it might lead you to a different assessment. All right, so let's talk about consumers a little bit. What's going on with the consumers? And there's a lot of quotes up here when I talk to growers and retailers about why they're getting this little bit of a slowdown and pushback by their customer base. This is what I hear. Weather still impacts sales. Lower demand because we're still a luxury, not an essential. Election uncertainty. Well, that's true, right? We generally have a pullback in our spending in an election year. That's a very real phenomena. Inflation is biting into discretionary spending. Well, in both countries, U.S. and Canada, we're seeing a curbing of that inflationary effect. So inflation is slowing down and it's getting more into the target range of the central banks. You're a little bit higher on the inflation scale than we are, but yours is coming down. Higher interest rates are curbing credit spending, no doubt, right? But the central banks, both the Fed and Bank of Canada, when they lower those rates, that's going to spur that latent demand that's been off on the side. So I'm really optimistic in terms of our industry. And then lastly, the higher prices for our flowers and plants is softening demand. Well, I, maybe, but I don't see it because when I consider what people are buying, they're still spending money and they're still spending money on some significant items. So just because our prices of plants, have we topped out our inelasticity demand? Well, that's a valid question. All right, so my point is there's some elements of these statements that are true. Like we always have to contend with weather in the U.S. and Canada. It's just the fact of life. Or we're a luxury, right? But people are still spending money. And this is your Canadian household consumption during the 81 recession, the 90 recession, the 2008 recession, and then present, right? So you can see that the present, you see the slowdown that's been occurring over the last 7 time periods here, but you see that it's bottomed and it's slowing. So slower population growth and increased payments to that's the forecast is what's going to crimp consumption's role in the economic growth next year. And you can see that the dark green is the consumption, the light green is the rest of the economy, and you can see that in 24 it's higher than 23, and in 25 expected to grow as well. Now, there's some data that I found in some market research reports that I follow that asked the question, compared to a year ago, is your household better off or worse off than it was last year financially, right? So you can see in Canada that people that feel that they are worse off, there's fewer of them in this most recent time period than in previous. So there's fewer people thinking that you're worse off, and there's more people, slightly higher, more people thinking that they're better off compared to globally. The top concerns that Canadian consumers have right now is rising food prices, but again, that's slowing. The rate of growth in terms of inflation is slowing. The increased housing cost, again, you can't raise interest rates and not have that. And then because of the dearth of supply, it's supply and demand. When you have a shorter supply, the demand for that housing is going to increase prices. We have higher prices here in the U.S. too. So affordability is rock bottom right now, just like it is in Canada. But the interest rate changes, the interest rates coming down are going to change that. So that's good. And you can see some of the other things. I won't go through all of these. The economic downturn is a top spending concern. And, you got global warming and global conflict. And there's a number of things that affect people's mindset. And Canadians have become more cautious in their spending. You see the pink portion of these bars, the number of people that are not impacted financially, but they're just cautious with their spending, right? So that number has been increasing. They're holding off for a little bit. And some Canadian consumers have been waiting to see what the heck happens in the U.S. in terms of the election. Now, I'm not going to get off in politics. I'll just say that from an economic standpoint, we did not have the optimal outcome in our election. There's some challenges that the U.S. is going to have to face. Now, I wanted to show you very quickly the U.S. situation because we injected $10 trillion worth of COVID relief, and that's the spikes in both nominal income and real income. Real is adjusted for inflation. And I'm just showing you the U.S. because I want to give you some hope here because I don't have the same exact data on the Canadian side, but consumers are consumers. So well, you see, this is what the U.S. consumers have spent right up until the pandemic. Then we see the big drop off. Then we throw $10 billion in fiscal and monetary relief at consumers and businesses. We recover very quickly, and we're starting to grow at the same rate, right? And then over here on the left in these smaller boxes, I put our consumer confidence index. And we, U.S. consumers, just like Canadian consumers, get up in arms about what they see on the news. And depending on the day, we feel good and we feel bad. We feel good, we feel bad. Notice that our spending doesn't have the same erratic nature as our confidence. So I don't care how we feel. In fact, let me just stop sharing there. Let me say it so you can see my face when I say it. I really don't care how you feel as a consumer. I care how you spend your money. And both in the US and Canada, the consumer consumption and what businesses expend, business expenditures and consumer consumption, that's the biggest part of GDP in terms of how GDP is broken down. So it's very critical. And you can see very clearly in terms of the US consumers, they're spending money. They don't care how they feel. And I think that there's a certain element of that that's true with the Canadian consumers. And when we look at, wait a minute, I didn't mean to go over there. I've got a link there just to show you the data in the Federal Reserve System there. What I need to go is there. So this light aqua line, I think it's aqua, I don't know what color that is, but it's aqua. That's what we spend on our pets. The orange is that data I was showing you earlier on flowers, seeds, and potted plants, right? That's the flowers, seeds, and potted plants. And then the light blue is what we are spending, this is US data, on boats, BOATS, boats. You can see prior to the pandemic and then now, after the pandemic, we're still spending. You don't spend money on boats when you're concerned about recessions, right? So when you ask people, do you feel good or real good about the economy? And you see all this mixed messaging, I don't listen to that. I look here where people are spending their money. And I see increases like that. And when you consider food services, that which we're buying at bars and restaurants, and our recreational vehicles, and our recreational goods, and recreational services, our gym memberships, our golf memberships, don't be talking to me about hard times, because these are luxury goods. All right, so if flower seeds and potted plants are in that same category, then why don't you see this same kind of growth? Well, I think part of it is that we as an industry have not conveyed our value proposition to the extent that we have, the extent that we could have. We just came through a global health pandemic, and flowers, shrubs, and trees and landscape services provide a ton of health and well-being benefits. So we need to promote that more and more, right? We need to promote the fact that dementia and Alzheimer's patients remember stuff better and they're more well-behaved in the midst of flowers, shrubs, and trees. We need to talk about the kids that have school gardens in their schools. The incidence of bullying goes way down. Scholastic performance in that school goes way up. We need to talk about the fact that people who are sick in the hospital have views upon nature outside the window, flowers and potted plants in the hospital room, less pain meds. They don't stay in the hospital as long. So there's a ton of information there. And I had interviews with the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, tons of magazines calling me saying, Charlie, what's the deal with this gardening and landscaping craze? everybody's spending and spending more time outside. I said, because we're in a health crisis, we're staying at home, and that's one of the few things we can do with our friends and our family that is meaningful. And so that's why we have more people. And plus, it's a health pandemic, so we need to emphasize that more and more. I'll get off my soapbox. I got to keep going. GDP, this is your Canadian GDP. Yeah, it's been a rough couple of years, right? You can see the GDP performance go down, and that's where the difference is between Canada and the U.S. And you can see that in 2024, the year is going to finish a little better than 23. But the encouraging word for you in Canada is that the forecasts are that 25 is going to be good. And from every indicator that I follow, both in the US and Canada, economic performance in 2025 should be better. Even the fact that the election resulted here in the US in a non-optimal fashion from the economy, right? Now, how's that for talking politically correct? Even though that happened in a non-optimal fashion, the lawn and garden sector in 2025 is still poised to be pretty good. Because even if we go into recession in U.S. and Canada, we generally get a year's reprieve in the lawn and garden sector. So our next spring is usually still pretty good. So I'm still very optimistic about 2025. And so if you look going forward in terms of real GDP and real GDP per capita, it's going to bump in 2025, like you see where my cursor is, and then it'll slow down a little bit, but it's going to be stable relative to what you've seen in Canada over the last 6 to 8 quarters, right? So it's things are going to get better. Here's the difference in our growth here in the U.S. and you guys. I mean, there's $2 billion a day in trade between U.S. and Canada. We're connected at the hip, and yet there was over the last 2 years has been a disconnect, and your growth has been a lot smaller here in the U.S. Now you took a little different policy stance during the pandemic than we did. We threw $10 trillion at our problem, and you can solve the consumption problem, but you create an inflation problem. So that now we're having to deal with the aftermath of that. And it's the same way here in the States. You know, the recent performance has been lower, but then we're forecast to go back to that same 2% that we did pre-pandemic. Now, corporate profits, however, have been high. And that's one of the issues still why inflation is still raising its head. In our stock market here, we can see that every president, you hear all this, every president since FDR has said, I have presided over the historic high of the stock market. Well, that's true for every single president. It was true for Obama, the same for Trump, same for Biden. That's because the stock market is ever increasing like that. So just a quick note, if you take all the people on the red line and all the people on the blue line and you ask them about the economy, and during the Obama years, all the people on the blue line felt the economy is doing good, and all the people on the red line not so good. And the day that former President Trump was inaugurated, the lines flipped. And all the red people are up here, the blue people down here. Coronavirus, everybody's feeling bad, and then the Democrats are feeling good, and when Biden was inaugurated, and the Republicans not so good. So again, I don't care how you feel. I don't care how you vote. I care how you spend your money. In the lawn and garden sector, that's what we live on. We create our emotions for our customers. And that's what we got to focus on. So we can't fall prey to the rhetoric of the politics season. Because even though the economy has been really pretty well in the United States, there was at least half the population that thought we were in recession. And we call it the vibes that people were feeling, the vibe session. And we were trying to go through that. The good news is that the supply chain is really doing pretty good. Input costs, the growth rate and input costs, this is that index of prices paid that I was talking about earlier. we had that 21% that I talked about were inputs like containers and media and fertilizers, et cetera, increased by 21%. Well, this year, only about a 1% increase. I have about a 3% forecast for next year. So I'd stay tuned because I'm doing my update in February. And so be on the lookout for that in the trade press. Labor, businesses in Canada, obviously, over the last 2 years, you've seen the decrease, the pandemic bump, and then going back to kind of below historical averages, but you're heading back in the opposite direction. Now, household formation in Canada versus housing completions. This is where I was talking about. You don't have enough houses that you've completed to satisfy the number of households that are formed. That's a problem. That increases price and it limits the number of flower, shrubs, and trees and landscape services going in around those. So migration, while it took off in 22, you've got a new policy in terms of that migration, so we know that's going to be slowing down. That should enable your housing sector to catch a breath and to catch up. But you still got to have some policy measures. So you got to be talking to legislators as to how can we incentivize the faster home building so we can put people in homes that don't have a home. Now, you got to affect that affordability, and that's going to come back to supply and demand because you can see that owning a home has never been so unaffordable, but that's because of interest rates and it's because of supply. Interest rates are starting to come down in Canada. The supply should increase because of that, right? So you've got, yeah, it's a bad situation right now, but you're on the precipice of a better time and a better 2025 than what you've been over the last 2 years. Housing starts, again, this you can see 24 relative to the end of 23. It's been very mixed in terms of housing starts. So you gotta find some ways to incentivize those housing starts. And I threw this in here. This is a ridiculous slide to have in a webinar, but again, you can stop the recording whenever you get access to the recording, and you can see it by region within Canada because it does make a difference what region. Now, very quickly, inflation, because I've got a few more minutes here and I want to leave time for some more Q&A. Consumer Price Index. Yes, your inflation has been similar to the U.S., but now it's starting to stabilize, right? And so inflation should start coming down. It's the same way in the U.S. We had all that big inflation, whether we looked at the PCE, which is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. That's what the Federal Reserve looks at. The CPI is what's reported by the media, and most consumers look at that. But really, I'm focused over here. And so the headline is 2.2%, just barely above the 2% target that the Fed uses. So the federal funds rate is projected to go all the way down to 4.4 by the end of the year. And that means that in the November meeting, which I think the announcement is today, if I'm remembering correctly, we should see another 25 basis points decrease in the federal funds rate, which means that the central bank in Canada, in Florida, why did I say Florida? The central bank in Canada is going to follow suit. You're going to see lowering interest rate. So recessions, this graphic was in The Economist, and it's talking about the GDP per person in Canada and how that has declined from 28. Again, their forecast was looking at a further decline. I don't think that that's true. I think we're going to see real per capita GDP trends. While they're mimicking prior recessions now, I think we're going to see some improvement. And I think there's going to be that uptick in unemployment that's been consistent with the recessionary times. I think there's going to be a turnaround there. So here we go. I've given you some U.S. data. I've given you some Canadian data. Basically, it shows that in the green industry, we've had mixed performance. There are firms that are doing well. There are firms that are in that expanded demand environment that still haven't done well. Those are the firms I worried about. The consumers, they're slowing down a little bit, both in US and Canada, but they're still spending. The stock market that you hear so much about, and so many point to as to whether we're doing good or bad, just be reminded that that stock market is not the real economy. It's only a measure of expectations of the future. And we've seen in most parts of the world in the aftermath of the election, just because the election is over with, there was a bump in the stock market. Was that unique to this election? No. Every time a U.S. election for president is held, the day after we see a lift in the stock markets. You look at the data for the last 50 years, and it happens that way. So you get some effect just because people are tired of hearing about election, about election, about election. So they're holding on their money. And then when the election's over with, then they start turning loose of that money. So what does that mean for us, right? There's some basic pillars of profit that I got over here on the right about innovating, constantly improving, looking at customer needs, sustainability. I think in Canada, you've been much more proactive in terms of making your lawn and garden industry, your green industry more sustainable relative to the U.S. We're trying to catch up to you. And then the operational excellence that's needed. And of course, we got to keep our people engaged. Those are the pillars of profit. So I got this to-do list. I go back over to the left. We got to do some more in-depth analysis on our customers. When I say satisfying customer needs is a pillar of profit, well, duh, that's not rocket science. How do you get there? Well, you got to do the analytics. You got to look at by main customer. And I'm not just talking about ranking your customers top to bottom. I'm talking about looking at the cost of servicing those customers. Because sometimes your largest customer is not your most profitable customer. So you got to do some analytics there, and you got to do some voice of the customers. You got to do some calling of these folks and asking them, how can we further our relationship? How can we make this more win-win? You're one of my most important customers. What is it that we can implement in order to be, both of us, be more profitable? And then we got to look at our SKUs, right? We got to look at SKUs in terms of the products that we're growing, not just rank them in terms of top to bottom, in terms of the sales they represent, but rank them in terms of gross margin, right? So we got to build in cost. Well, that's more analytics. We got to look at the numbers more because it's getting harder to sell. We have to work harder to get to where we were during the pandemic. The pandemic spoiled us. We were selling stuff almost in spite of ourselves. Those days are gone. We have to go back to selling and back to the analytics. Third, lead with your value proposition. There's tremendous economic benefits of what we do, property values, etc. Ecosystem services associated with what we do in terms of carbon sequestration, in terms of stormwater runoff mitigation, that mean dollars, millions of dollars to communities. Just look at the dollars that have been spent in Toronto, for example, and the millions of dollars that Toronto has saved from implementing green infrastructure and not have to put in redundant gray infrastructure just to handle stormwater runoff. So it does mean dollars, but we got to lead with that value proposition, particularly from a health and well-being standpoint. Fourth, you got to manage that working capital like I started talking about earlier. And then we've done our election homework, but now the homework changes. Now that the election's over with, and now you see the policy responses that are going to be made in the U.S., what does that mean for the Canadian situation? So now your homework changes. You got to think about, okay, in the wake of these, choose my adjective wisely, these unwise tariffs that are going to be implemented, what's our policy response? what's our response, strategic response as a business? Now that we see maybe the debt, the national debt in the U.S. going up faster than what it was, what does that mean in Canada? Is it what are the things that are that are going to be happening in the U.S.? How's that going to affect our trade situation? How's that going to affect your policy stance from running your own business, right? Now, some of this is macro oriented, and sometimes we just focus in on our markets and focus in on our customers and focus in on our employees. The rest of it kind of shakes itself out because there are people who made money during the Great Recession. There are a lot of people who made money during the Great Pandemic, the Great Shutdown, I call it, but that's because of all the assistance. I'm talking about the Great Recession that affected worldwide. There were people in the green industry that made money during that time period. Few, but they were the ones that did all those things that I just talked about right there. So that's why I gave you that to-do list. That's why I talked about all these things. Whew, man. So, Ann, I have given 30 pounds of sugar and stuffed it in a 5-pound sack in about an hour. So I got a little bit more energy left to answer any remaining questions that there might be.
Yes, anyone, if you have any questions, put in the Q&A section, or I can also unmute you if you like. And yes, wow, that's a lot of information to take.
But
please
but
do know
you
everybody.
see you see why I'm called Professor Silver Lining,
Yes,
because regardless of the economic conditions, I can always find a reason for hope. And I can always find a reason, particularly in our industry. If we can't be the positive ones in society, who else can? Because we surround ourselves with flowers, shrubs, and trees. And we know the cortisol levels in our body go way down, right? Where the stress just evaporates in the midst of what we do. So we're
yeah.
the answer to a lot of societal problems, a lot of societal issues.
And as we say here at the CNLA, plants do love you, and they are the life. And I think we have to really continue with that message and how important plants are.
Yeah, yeah. Now, see Greg's note there. Thank you for the speaking, not from facts, not feelings. Well, I did interject a few feelings there, but I'm all about the data, man. That's because so many people, you hear the rhetoric that's so negative. Well, if you just look at the facts and look at the data, then all this stuff about consumer confidence and so forth, if you look at where they're spending money, then it just eliminates a lot of the confusion.
Facts are key. You know what? I'm really going to miss you next year at our summit, but I'm so happy that you're able to join us here today. And I think, you're going to have some more data next year. I think we're going to have you back, Dr. Hall.
Oh, yeah. In fact, it's from a post-election perspective, now that we know which administration that we're going to be dealing with and the policies that are going to be implemented, next year is going to be quite interesting in terms of the responses by our industry in the midst of that. And of course, that's the same as again, because we're so closely connected, a lot of the things that happens here happens there too.
For sure. And it looks like we do have another question. Do you see that?
I do. Do you have any data about retail consumption by different age groups? There are some studies. Bridget Behe, who retired recently from Michigan State, of course, used to do a lot of market research. Some of that is in the latest National Gardening Survey, and I know that that's U.S. data, but the Canadian consumer demonstrates some of those same trends. So you can purchase the National Gardening Survey. It's very detailed in terms of the breakdown by age. We don't collect a lot of consumer data except when we start doing our willingness to pay studies. So you can search journals like Hort Technology or the Journal of Environmental Horticulture, one of those two, for Behe, Melinda Knuth, Alicia Wren, Charlie Hall, and see some of those publications. Like there's one just on houseplants, and we look at houseplant demand by age group. So in specific research studies, that's where we come up with that demographic breakdown. But for the general population, I'd look at things like the National Gardening Survey.
How about Melinda? Melinda does some work on that, does she not?
Oh yeah, yeah. So that's one of the names to
Have her up as
search.
one of our speakers for the summit in
Yeah, she was a PhD student of mine, and just remarkable. And she's now on the faculty at NC State, I think in
Yep.
her third or fourth year, starting her fourth year there at NC State. Just outstanding in fact, when I retire, people are going to forget about me so
Oh,
fast.
no, I don't think
It's
so.
going to be Melinda this and so anyway.
But okay, it looks like we don't have any other questions. Again, we will have this webinar available to everybody. If you do have any questions as you come out of this webinar, please feel free to email me, and I'll be sure Dr. Hall will get an answer from him for sure. Also, just to let you know, next year we do have the GCC Summit, which will be in Winnipeg, July 6th to the 9th, and we will have Melinda hopefully speaking there. She is remarkable. And maybe the following year, maybe we'll get Dr. Hall back, possibly. But
Yeah,
thank you so much for this webinar today, Dr. Hall.
And thanks so much for the invitation. Obviously, I track US and Canada at the same time because we are so closely connected, and I have so many Canadians that are in my benchmarking and my Eagle program. And so I appreciate the efforts of working very closely with your organization. So thank you for the invite.